open up our joint meeting. We don't have the formality of a roll call, so I'm just going to assume that everybody's here and everybody knows everybody. So had a great day yesterday, and we want to make sure that we put federal highways to work right early in the morning. So Vince Mamano, you're up.
Is that on? Good morning, everybody. I'm Vince Mamano. I'm the Division Administrator for the Federal Highway Administration. In California, I think we say I have very deep pockets and they're full of money, but I have very short arms and I can't reach the money. So my counterparts, Phil Ditzler and Dan Mathis in Washington and Oregon, have similar problems. We all have to go to the same seamstress. So now on behalf of Dan Mathis, our Division Administrator for Washington State, and Phil Ditzler, our Division Administrator for Oregon, welcome to California. We were hoping all three of us would be able to be here. We were unable to make that work. Had a couple things going in Oregon and Washington that they weren't able to join us. Wanted to share a couple things with you that are going on. Just kind of in the spirit of yesterday and today, there's been some joint work between California and Oregon and some other areas. We had Oregon is looking at congestion pricing, and they're investigating that area. So Federal Highway has a technology transfer program where we can fund peer reviews and peer exchanges and have different agencies and people go and talk with other people about different things. We actually funded California to go up to Washington and Oregon several years ago to look at this thing called a road user charge thing, and several years ago, and so that came out of T-squared money. And so with congestion pricing in Oregon, just in July earlier this year, we're down here in the Bay Area met with the Golden Gate Bridge Authority, met with San Francisco, so met with several on looking at the difference in how to manage pricing and how to manage congestion with the use of pricing. So that was kind of a neat opportunity that we were able to make happen. And those are the types of things that we would encourage you to, if there's something you're looking at and you know another state is doing it. P3s, 15 years ago, we were funding trips for one state to go to another and talk with that. There's opportunities for that. So please talk with your federal highway partner to try and get that opportunity taken care of for you. There's a lot of communication also between Oregon and California on our fires. I think all of our states are a little bit toasty right now, and so there's a lot of discussion between our states on the borders. But at the national level, the two things we have going are our authorization, which is the FAST Act. Many of you heard of the FAST Act. That's our 5-year authorization. Kind of our Congress says this is how much you can spend till 2020, and then each year we get our appropriations and say, okay, that's how much we said you can spend, but this is actually how much you can spend. So when you hear the government shutdown and that type of thing, it's tied around appropriations. So the current status on our appropriations, so our federal fiscal year is the end of September. We have our authorization goes till 2020, the FAST Act. The current status of our appropriations, the Senate took up a 2-year minibus that was passed by the House, that went over to the Senate. They took it up. They added 2 more areas to that, and which were transportation and I think agriculture was the other. So now they passed those. They sent it back to the House. So the House is in recess right now, so they're not back yet. But when the House gets back, they have the opportunity to a couple different things. They can accept the 2 bills, pass the 2 bills, and move on. They can just take the whole thing to conference and negotiate from there, or couch it all and figure something else out. So that's where that sits. So that's our yearly appropriation. So if you hear continuing resolution, which is what we've lived off of, the 3-month here, and then the 4-month, and then the 1 month, and then the 1 week or 2 week, and then the 8 months. So if you see that, that's the area we're talking about right now with our funding. August redistribution should be coming out shortly. We are in August. The anticipation is there's going to be a little bit more August redistribution money coming this year than there has been in the past. I know California, I want to say, put in for $700 or $800 million worth of August redistribution requests. And when I was talking to Caltrans, they were pretty sure we could have spent a lot more than that if we needed to. Reality is our most we've ever gotten, I think, is $280 million here in California. So I haven't done my research on Washington and Oregon. The last thing would be the build program. Excuse me, the build program. That all that money used to be called Tiger, now it's called Build. All those projects have already been closed. Federal Highway and the DOT, the Secretary's office, is putting together teams now to evaluate all those. So we're hoping to get some information on who gets awarded the build projects. And then the infra grants that were awarded a month or so ago. Last Friday was the last day that Congress had the opportunity to challenge any of those, and I'm not aware of any challenge that Congress has made, so those will be moving through. I know California got a couple of those, so we'll be working with our locals. I'll talk this afternoon, I think, with our locals on what the next steps are there. I think that's all I have. Is there any questions for me or any of my counterparts that aren't here that I can speak for, and it's their own fault for letting me speak for them?
Anybody have a question for Vince? Okay, Vincent, I'm going to jump in, and I know this.
Darn it! Freight. Sorry. Freight's good.
Okay.
Freight's good. Yay, freight. Go ahead.
No,
You're right.
Vince. Come on, work with me here. No, US DOT is having a workshop on freight in Chicago on the September 5th and 6th. And it's really looking at the national dialogue on highway automation. So I think it's kind of timely given how we spent our day yesterday. Right. So we'll make sure that you all have that info. But it's the 5th and 6th of September in Chicago. So, Vince, I know you're going to be representing us there.
Right on the edge of my seat.
Reminding everybody that every day is a freight day.
Every day is a freight day.
There you go. There you go.
I forgot that.
Commissioner Van Konynenberg.
What are the conversations that are going on within your agency that are similar to what we're doing here? And do you feel like we're exchanging information in the most efficient way so that federal policy and the policies that we're coming up with at some point merge and become harmonized?
So yeah, I think there is a lot of communication. So there's a lot of communication through the AASHTOs and the WASHTO. So AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and each of the state transportation agents, DOTs, are a member of AASHTO. So there's a lot of conversation at the national level on AASHTO policy. Back when Complete Streets were coming out, and there was a lot of different things. Back when we were even talking about design build years ago, there was a lot of discussion between AASHTO and Federal Highway leadership, because AASHTO has the opportunity to lobby and we don't. So there's a lot of discussion. I think that any new innovations that are going on at the state and local level, division offices carry that message back. If you're looking for major national policy changes, that's typically done through an AASHTO. But I think there's a lot of communication that goes on between the states. This administration's had a lot of opportunity where they've brought the states in to discuss a lot of different things. So I feel like there is a lot of opportunity. But if you're seeing an area that there is some opportunity for improvement, then please share that with me.
I guess all three of us are going down the roads separately on formulating policies for autonomous electric vehicles.
Right.
I think it would be confusing if all 50 states had 50 different policies, 20 years from now.
Right.
So I guess my question is, who's going to be the leader to harmonize all these policies as each state comes together? At some point, we're going to have an overriding policy.
Right. And I think, and you kind of saw that with freight. So similarly with freight, we finally got a national freight policy. So I think that's the direction that'll happen. Right now, NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is kind of the home of the automated vehicle policy, because they're the ones that have been working with the DMVs on the laws. In California, I know the DMV had to write the law for the automated vehicle opportunity. So Federal Highway is very involved in that, but NHTSA has been the lead on that. But that's something that I'm actually going to be in D.C. next week with our national leadership meeting, that I'll bring back to them to make sure we are looking at that. And Fran, one last thing before I go, unless somebody else has something for me. Tribes. I've had an opportunity. Every time I speak, I try and make sure we're talking about tribes when we're talking about DBEs. So DBEs, disadvantaged business enterprises. California has really made a huge step in that area. When I got here in California 10 years ago, we were about 1.5% to 2.5% participation. Right now, we're at 13 or 14% participation with disadvantaged businesses. And just earlier this week in my office, there's a tribal summit, a tribal safety summit that we're having here, where we're bringing tribes in to work with their HSIP or HSIP program to figure out how they can compete for grants to help tribes, to educate tribes on the application process and the data needed, and to be able to make the case. So I would encourage all of you to make sure you're asking, where are the tribes? Where are the tribes here? We have 109 here in California to 113, depending on which day you're talking to us. And there's 640, I think, tribes in the country. And every opportunity you can have to have tribes at the table. Tribes should not be handed something to comment on. They should be at the table developing what they were going to comment on. So I'd encourage you to keep working with your locals and your contractors and everybody to make sure that tribes get to the table early, and make sure they're participating in all that you're participating in. Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul, to your question, the conference I was referring to was actually part of a broader conference that USDOT is doing on the dialogue regarding automation on our highways. So I think that's a more comprehensive program. It's not just exclusive to freight. So I think that's where some of those discussions are happening. But your point's well taken. A hopscotch of 50 different set of rules is going to make it all a huge challenge for everyone, I think. So anyway, well, thank you very much, Vince. Always great to have you. And anytime you all need some entertainment at your commission meetings, we'd be happy to share our buddy Vince Mamano with you.
There's a fee. There's a fee. All right.
Okay, moving along to our second item, transportation innovations. And we touched on this yesterday. And our first speaker, Ron Milan, is one of those sessions where you have your hearings and there's always one agenda item in a hearing throughout the year that everybody keeps reaching to the staff and saying, can you give us those documents again? What did we learn? What did we learn? So Ron's back this morning sharing with us a fascinating presentation that we've all been talking about ever since. So with that, Ron, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be welcomed back. I give this presentation often and don't often get invited back. So nice to be here. This is all about disruptive trends in transportation, and what we've been doing as part of our own research to understand what the current effects are, things we can measure on the ground today, but also forecasting the future and what's likely to happen, especially with the transition to autonomous vehicles. I want to start with this slide. As part of our research, we have identified 16 different disruptive trends. I won't have time to talk about all of them today. I'll focus mostly on the autonomous vehicles and things like transportation network companies, TNCs, that's Uber and Lyft basically, trying to understand what's happening on the vehicle side. And part of what we've done is put together some modeling to allow us to understand how VMT and transit ridership in particular have changed over time. So VMT is vehicle miles traveled, one of our more important metrics, especially for states like California, where we spend a lot of time focused on greenhouse gas reduction and air pollution. And in putting this information together, we found out that basically VMT per capita, these are national type averages, and they're annualized, was relatively stable in terms of growth from 1970 to about 2004. We basically saw VMT per capita increasing right alongside population and employment growth, and highly correlated with economic activity. But something happened in 2004. Things changed. We basically had a decoupling of economic activity from the vehicle activity. And this is obviously before the recession. So we started to see a decline. The decline continued right through the recession and all the way through 2012, where we started to see the trend going back up. The challenge for us as transportation planners and for decision makers like yourselves is that relatively large range of potential future outcomes, depending on whose forecast you want to select, anywhere from a low of about 8,000 VMT per capita annually in the future, this is year 2040, to as high as 18,000. And our models are generally aligned with this large range. That's a high degree of uncertainty for those of us that are either trying to make investment decisions in the network or trying to help our clients make transportation network modifications. So what we thought we'd do is try and narrow the range for you. So I want to show you some evidence that might help, but it's also going to raise some policy questions that are appropriate for you to be weighing in on. First, I call this the tipping point slide, trying to understand what the really big forces are in these disruptive trends. The first one was sharing. Around 2013, when we were able to start sharing our vehicles and then started to share bikes and then eventually scooters, really opened up a number of different travel choices. Prior to 2013, at least with regards to vehicles, you either owned one, you rented one for at least a whole day, or you took a taxi. Sharing really expanded our options. And the next big force, the autonomous vehicles. We expect to have similar effects. There's going to be a number of different choices that travelers will have. What form those choices come in, though, will depend on government policies and government regulations that aren't yet in place. And so it's going to be very important to have that conversation. And I appreciate the comments earlier about the need for some type of synchronization between the states, because we are in a current position where when it comes to some of these disruptive modes, whether it's the TNCs or it's the scooters, every state, every city is taking slightly different policy approaches. So one of our big questions is, when will the autonomous vehicles get here? So we've looked at the academic research. We've also looked at business research. And it's a pretty wide trend. By 2040, anywhere from about 20 to 80% of the vehicle fleet being autonomous, depending on your particular source. There's at least one source that predicted something quite a bit more aggressive, upwards of 95% of passenger miles here in the U.S. by 2030. Delivered by transportation as a service. That's similar to what Uber and Lyft do, an autonomous electric vehicle. And this came from Tony Seba at a TRB presentation earlier this year. This created a lot of discussion at TRB. Even if Tony was only half right about the electric vehicle penetration, big impact on your gas tax revenue. But more importantly, the evidence he used to make this prediction is not all that far-fetched. He looked at things like how quickly we transitioned from an equestrian-based transportation system to one using all cars, and it was about 15 years. So these things can happen very quickly. If you think about Uber and Lyft, which I imagine some of us took to the meeting today, they didn't exist prior to 2012. So it hasn't been that long, and now they're consuming a lot of the travel in places like downtown San Francisco. So one of the things that we wanted to look at here was also the evidence in terms of what's happening with VMT, one of our more important metrics. It's been increasing nationally since 2012. We thought California might be different because of our greenhouse gas laws here in the state and our focus on reducing VMT. It hasn't. VMT per capita has been increasing even here in California. In fact, last year we were one of the fastest growing states with regards to VMT. So we have a lot of laws, regulations, policies, plans aimed at reducing this, but private sector actions, these disruptive forces, have been pushing the variables in the other direction. Another important part of this is we didn't predict it was coming. If you look at our regional MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization models, they don't include Uber and Lyft. They don't include autonomous vehicles. And so there was a number of vehicle trips and VMT that we just simply missed. We had blind spots. Research from UC Davis shows us that about 60% of the riders in Uber and Lyft vehicles are basically brand new vehicle trips. These passengers would have otherwise taken transit, walked, or bike, or not made their trip at all. Those might be the drunk people, and that's okay. But this is brand new vehicle travel we didn't account for. Just like if we look forward and look at autonomous vehicles, the whole goal is to lower the cost of using vehicles and make them easier to use from door to door. In that world, if you make vehicle use more ubiquitous, you make it lower cost, you can expect more of it, but it's not built into our models today, whether it's California, Oregon, or Washington. And then there's the effect on transit. I like this chart in particular because it shows you how big of a decline we've had nationally in transit ridership despite not having a recession. In the past, we had recessions that caused service declines that led to ridership declines. You can look at the 2008-2009 recession. That was previously one of the biggest drops. We've had a much larger drop here since 2015 in a growing economy. So that one caught our attention. We spent some time looking at it. It is happening in almost every metro area, except for those of you from Washington. Good job, Seattle. So we tried to understand what was going on here. Seattle spent a lot more money, basically increasing and enhancing their transit service, while many other metro areas were challenged just to maintain the networks they'd already built. And there was obviously some places like DC that had real problems with maintenance that contributed to outages. So transit is definitely in a unique spot here. One of the biggest challenges we see as transportation planners, and I do a lot of modeling. In the past, when I build models, we always had transit ridership increasing at the same time employment increased. The variables are highly correlated until about 2013, 2012. It's very difficult for me to build a model today on the most recent data because I would predict anytime employment goes up, transit ridership would go down. So it's definitely challenging for us to have a lot of confidence in those past models when we have direct evidence that something has dramatically changed. So what are we doing about it? We decided we better start testing these autonomous vehicles in our models and trying to understand whether our models can capture something that we can't yet observe on the ground. So we've taken, this says 9, we actually now have 10 regional models from around the country we've tested. 2 large freeway simulations where we wanted to verify that if you put autonomous vehicles on the freeway that throughput or capacity could go up. We did confirm that. These tests are relatively straightforward. There's some certain basic effects of autonomous vehicles you can kind of count on. Not paying for parking is one of them. Door-to-door delivery is another. You won't have to spend time driving anymore. Those are all variables in these models, as well as the increased freeway capacity. And also the fact that you can expect more people to use vehicles that don't hold driver's licenses. If you don't have to have a driver's license, you're under 16, you're elderly, or you're disabled, or for some other reason couldn't have a driver's license, you would now have access to vehicles that are relatively affordable because you don't have to own the vehicles. You basically can order a trip just like we do with Uber and Lyft today anytime you want one. So what happened? Well, as you might expect, you make vehicle travel less costly, both in time and money, and we make more vehicle trips. They can be longer, and we generate a lot more VMT. We were surprised by the magnitude of the VMT increase, upwards of over 60% in some of the models. We even tried to say, well, maybe everyone will share their vehicles in the future. No guarantee of that, depending on the government regulation. But even if we shared 50% of the trips, meaning we took drive-alone trips and put them in a carpool, we still saw large increases in VMT compared to not accounting for the AV effects. And this has implications for air quality, greenhouse gases, but also transit ridership. Transit ridership goes down, and it goes down by a lot. There is one model on here that showed an increase. It's the oldest model we tested and basically had limited sensitivity to a number of the variables. So we put it on here to remind us we need to make sure we keep our models updated. The more recent models, some of the most advanced ones we tested, showed the largest decreases, even for rail transit trips. You may have seen the pilot studies around the country for Uber and Lyft to provide access to transit stations. In the future, the cost of using the AAVs is so low, it's just more convenient to stay in the car and not pay the penalty of having to transfer between modes. So that type of pilot study may be working today, but at least the models are showing us it won't work in the future. So what do? Well, first you try and validate that our findings are correct. We found at least one study that did that, UC Berkeley. Fascinating experiment of offering free chauffeur service to 13 test subjects right here in the Bay Area. Their increase in VMT was even greater than ours, 76%. 22% of that is what they called ghost trips, or we call zero occupant trips. The vehicle basically going to park itself or going to pick up another passenger. The models we used didn't have that capability, so there's definitely some VMT we're missing. We also didn't account for long-term land use effects, so there's definitely higher VMT increases possible. Despite this experiment happening here in the Bay Area, if you look at the last bullet, virtually no biking or transit. It's a very good transit system here in San Francisco Bay Area, so the fact that these individuals chose not to use the chauffeur to get to the BART station and instead just use the car is another indicator that we may see much higher levels of VMT. So I want to leave you with some policy response ideas. As we wander about the country and work with lots of different clients, there's a desire to see more sharing versus what we have today, a lot of private ownership, what we call private in mind. For this transition to happen, we don't have evidence from our research or analysis that it'll happen on its own because of the private market. And I'll explain why in a minute. It's going to require action by groups like this that put in place policies or regulations that encourage us to share more vehicles. Part of the reason is the private market revenue model. Don't mean to pick on the TNCs, but they give us a great example of what the revenue model might look like for autonomous vehicles. Revenue today is derived by the miles you take on the trip, the minutes it takes, the demand level with surge pricing in effect, and your vehicle choice. Even in the suburbs, this is a suburb of California, 8 different vehicle choices here. And if you actually compare Uber and Lyft prices that are almost identical for just basic Lyft or basic UberX, where you see price differences is in the vehicle choice. So we expect in the future we'll continue to see autonomous vehicles in the pricing models. The miles, they'll be basically incentivized to sell us miles, whereas the public sector is supposed to be reducing the miles if we're to hit our greenhouse gas goals, for example. So there's a real dichotomy here between the public and private sectors. So what do you do? I think one of the challenges we're going to have is transportation network space allocation. A great lesson from Seattle, and I think also here in San Francisco, where we're seeing more bus lanes, is you have to prioritize the space, especially for the modes that provide us the most efficient use of that space, which transit, walking, bicycling, and even scooters offer. Those are changes that you can make. We've tested these in our models. We've actually tested making transit free, running it more frequently on 5-minute headways, and these bus-only lanes. Everything we did just made it more effective. And in response to the AVs, you're going to have to compete better than we do today. There's also, I think, a question of the markets that we serve with transit. This is from work we're doing in San Diego. If you look at the darker colors, the oranges and reds, those are places that have land use or trip density that's high enough to support with traditional fixed route bus service or fixed guideway service like light rail. The rest, the majority, is stuff where it's so low density you are better off just using demand responsive, crowdsourced type, either MicroTransit or possibly even the TNC type service. There's a real difference though between public transit and TNCs. Public transit, we operate on schedules and we pay workers for a whole shift. TNCs only have to incur costs when they make a trip. Very different, not a level playing field between the two. You may want to take advantage of that though in terms of trying to serve these areas. And then you've probably heard about MicroTransit, the idea that there's a better way of serving some of those low density areas with small vehicles. In general, these areas would benefit from more people moving around small vehicles. Here's a quick example of that. On the left, you have a standard intersection with standard size American vehicles, and then on the right, you have the little smart cars. The reason we did this little simulation to compare the two was we found out that the average American is only about 180 pounds, but the average American car is about 4,000 pounds. So gas, about $4 a gallon here in California. We take 17 cents a mile just to move the car, the mass of metal, the less than a penny to move the human. And we consume a lot of space, especially at signals. So traditional vehicles, the delay at this intersection, level service F is something we'd refer to it as, can be substantially improved by just changing the vehicle size to right sizing to the size of the people or the packages that it's trying to move. And then if we're going to talk about autonomous, let's talk about it in terms of autonomous rapid transit. Transit's one of the first places to use autonomous vehicles. It's one of the best places because they're on a fixed route. They don't have to learn the entire network. They only have to learn what's going on in their particular route. This is a test we did on Geary Street here in San Francisco using what we call little taxi bots. This uses app-based technology, much like Uber and Lyft does, to match multiple people to the same passenger vehicle. So what happens in this situation is 4 people are going to a common destination. The app would match them to a single vehicle that could bypass all the other stations because it knows it's going to a common destination. Big improvement in travel time, making transit just much more effective. What I want to leave you with as a final thought is none of what we've shown you today, the results, the high increase in VMT or the low transit ridership is set in stone. Government regulation, government policies are going to have a tremendous effect on the ultimate outcome. So your role in the transportation planning and decision-making process is going to be essential for us to figure out exactly what's going to happen in the future. With that, thank you very much.
Great. So I think we'll follow the same format as yesterday and hold all our questions. But Ron, thank you so much. And Paul, I think you know now why some of the California commissioners question having 2 2040 plans. After we had this presentation, we were lucky to feel good about how we get one plan together. So anyway, we'll hold our questions, but thank you so much. So next up, hailing from the great area of Southern California, Joshua Schenk is here from LA County Metro, and many of you may know Joshua from his days at the Eno Foundation. I think that's where I first met Joshua. We've been delighted to have him in LA for 3 years now. Is that about it? Yeah, so great. Great. Thank you, Joshua.
My pleasure. And I was really interesting listening to Ron's presentation. A lot of things you're going to see are overlapping it. There were a lot of fundamental things that I didn't agree with, but then the policy conclusions were all the same. So you're going to see a lot of overlap in terms of where we should be going. So I run the Office of Extraordinary Innovation at LA Metro, and despite my best efforts, I can't, use magic potions or anything to change transportation. I don't have any superpowers. I don't even have a cape, which Phil, my boss, promised me I would get upon taking this job. And so I can't work miracles. Innovation turns out at a large agency like LA Metro to be mostly about policy and trying to do challenging policy changes, like the ones Ron was describing, that have always been challenging and are still challenging. But we're putting a stronger emphasis on them because we need to solve the problem. The problem we have in LA County, if you've been there recently or even in the last 20 years, you probably know that mobility is not working well. Passengers and goods movement not going very fast, not going anywhere in a reliable manner, and so we need to take that on. Our thesis is that the only way we can do that is to reduce the number of people driving alone. It's a simple math problem. There are way too many people driving alone. We've got a very small number of transit users. That's less than 10% in LA County. We've got a small number of people using other modes besides driving alone. That has to change, and therefore we have to try things that could get fewer people to drive alone and more people to not drive alone. That's the theory. I've organized this presentation on quotes that I've heard since I've been at Metro just to kind of give you a sense of the things that I hear as an innovation officer and the challenges that we face. This is a great quote. We have to have stretch goals that are realistic. Yes, stretch goals are realistic. That does not actually mean it's a stretch goal. One of the things we've been emphasizing is that we have to set goals that are much higher than what we've done before because the problem keeps getting worse and we haven't been improving. The way we've done that is through our Metro Strategic Plan, Vision 2028. It's on our website, and you can check it out. Fran was a part of that. We worked with people across LA County to develop this plan, and it establishes the mission, vision, and goals for the organization. Now, why is the strategic plan in the Innovation Office? Well, because if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, you can't actually develop innovative ways to achieve it. And Metro had not had a strategic plan for some time. So we set those goals, we established a number of initiatives based on those goals, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to talk about the mobility side, which is the first goal, which gets to this idea of increasing capacity for non-SOV modes and improving the quality of the existing transit system, both things that Ron was talking about. Right now, we have a system that favors of driving alone in terms of the supply side, right? There are many, many more options if you're driving alone than there are if you want to take transit or use a mode that has multiple people in it. So we have to change the supply side, and we're doing that. You've probably heard of Measure M. It's $120 billion worth of investment in our transit system over the next 40 years. So we're building out the rail system, but we're also going to have to build the bus lanes. We're going to have to set aside capacity for transit all across LA County if we're going to make a difference. The quality of that transit system also has to improve. Right now, the average person using our transit system has an income, a household income of $19,000 a year. And that's in LA County, which is one of the wealthiest counties in America. So you can imagine that it is really a choice of last resort. That's why we've been adding, in the last 10 years, 2.3 million people and 2.1 million cars. Because once you can get a car, you get it, because it's a much better mode of transportation. That has to change. But we also have to deal with the demand side. And this is where people often get scared, right? Because it's easy to build stuff, especially if you're an elected. It's easier to go out and say, let's build new stuff. Everyone gets you get a car, or you get a train. But it is much harder to say, okay, we're going to have some regulation, we're going to have some pricing. But those things have to happen, because right now we're allocating street space in a way that we would not allocate any other good. It is on a first come, first served basis. If you show up in your vehicle, you get it. But that doesn't make any sense, because if you're allocating street space on that basis, you're always going to have lines. That's what why lines happen. That's why traffic happens, because we're allocating it based on a first come, first served basis. There's no out-of-pocket cost other than your time. That has to change, and that's why we're looking at congestion pricing for Los Angeles, because if we don't, we simply will not solve this problem. And the reason that the taxpayers voted to give us 1 cent on the sales tax forever is that they expect us to do something about traffic congestion, not just to build transit, but to really deal with mobility and goods movement and all the things that matter within the LA area. Part of this also has to be dealing with the transportation network companies, as Ron mentioned. They are a minority of trips, very small minority of trips, but they are creating more congestion, and they do have social and environmental costs to them. And that right now they're being regulated as if they are technology companies and not as if they are taxi companies, when they are clearly taxi companies. And it may or may not be LA Metro's responsibility, but somebody has to do a better job than we're doing at regulating the TNCs to create a level playing field, because right now they're underpricing and contributing to that same problem on our roadways. Here's another quote that I heard. This is a really innovative idea, but we can't do it. It's never been done before. That's a classic response to innovation. One of the things that we're doing that's never been done before in Los Angeles at this scale is our MicroTransit pilot. You may have heard about this, and Ron, of course, was mentioning the idea of MicroTransit. This is our attempt to see, well, what happens if a public sector organization operates an on-demand service? We're going to use our drivers, we're going to use our vehicles, we're going to be providing a metro service that is on demand. We've done this in an incredibly unique way. I can't talk about everything at the moment because we just don't have time, but I'll tell you that we have currently 3 teams working to develop microtransit plans for us. And we are going to pick and choose among which ones we like in order to put the service out on the street next year. So it's an incredibly exciting and bold initiative that will be the biggest experiment in microtransit that we've seen in this country. And the reason that we're doing that is that many people in Los Angeles face trips that on regular transit are not reasonable choices, and they're only doing it because they have to. If you're taking a bus in traffic and waiting 20 minutes for it, and then transferring to another bus in traffic and waiting 20 minutes for it, and your whole ride takes 2 hours to go 5 miles, that's crazy. Microtransit may be a way to attack that problem. Here's another one. If we improve our service, more people will use it, and we can't afford that. That's a classic transit line. And you hear it mostly with access services, which is services for the people who need it the most, right? People who are really mobility challenged. We have to think about ourselves differently. We can't have that mentality. One thing that we're trying to do to improve our service is a different kind of on-demand service, which is a partnership with the TNC. So in the microtransit version, we're doing the service. In this version, which we're trying out through a grant from FTA, we are partnering with VIA, which is a TNC that we like to call one of the good guys. And they are trying to see if they operate service in an area around our stations, bringing people to and from our stations, will that increase transit ridership? Well, if people have a better option to get to and from those stations, because if you've been to Los Angeles, you know it's often difficult to get to and from our rail stations, particularly because there's hostile environments for bicycles and pedestrians, but also because it's just very spread out. Sound Transit is a partner with us on this grant. They're all doing a similar partnership. We've already selected our stations. We're finalizing our contract negotiations. And this is a great example of trying to figure out where the best of private sector and public sector can come together to create benefits, right? Because TNCs in cities right now tend to be unusable for several population groups, right? If you don't have a smartphone, or if you don't have a data plan, if you don't have a bank account, if you need to have an accessible vehicle, or if you're just very low income, you cannot use a TNC. So it's not available for everyone. This will be available to all those groups if you're going to and from these stations. And so the test is, well, if we open up TNC services to groups that couldn't previously afford it or have it available, will we then get more people riding transit? And it's really exciting. This is a quote that I've heard a number of times. We could have thought of that on our own. Yes, you could have thought of that on your own. Not really relevant. It's akin to abstract art, or Jackson Pollock. Like, we look at that the first time, we're like, I could have done that. Yes, but you didn't. That would be the key difference. And so one of the things that we've done is open up our innovation office and all of Metro to private sector ideas. And we've done that by saying, give us your idea and we will consider it and get back to you within 90 days. That's our unsolicited proposal policy. We started in February 2016. We've received over 100 unsolicited proposals. We've gotten them on almost everything you can possibly imagine. A number of them have been on P3s. So when I talk about P3s, I don't just mean a partnership with the private sector. Almost everything we do is a partnership with the private sector. I mean where the private sector is bringing financing to a major infrastructure project. And we've developed 3 public-private partnerships based on ideas from the private sector. 2 for planned rail projects under Measure M, Weston Anna Branch and Sapulpa Transit Corridor, and 1 for our strategic managed lanes network. So those are all projects that, because the private sector suggested them, and because we do have money in Measure M for them and from future toll revenue, we're able to accelerate those projects and deliver them in a more innovative manner through public-private partnerships. Just go through them real quick. The Weston Anna Branch is a new rail line coming southeast from downtown Los Angeles. Cost is probably more like $5 or $6 billion, but we estimated 3 to 4. The planned groundbreaking is 2022. We have these proposals from the private sector that indicated to us that they thought with our cash flow situation and availability payment model, they could accelerate these projects pretty substantially and deliver them a whole project by 2028, even though we had phased the project into 2 phases and we're planning on delivering it by 2041. So that's really exciting. We're moving forward on that project. It's a high priority for the agency. The Sapulpa Transit Corridor is another really exciting project. This one is trying to get through the mountain range that separates the valley from the city, which is a major problem, especially for those of us who live in the valley, because there are very few ways to get to the city from the valley. There's one highway, the 405. If you've ever been on it, you know the misery that it is. This would provide a transit alternative, but you have to go through a mountain range, and that is not easy. The private sector gave us suggestions for how we might do that for much lower cost than we thought possible and that we had planned. And so we decided to use a project development agreement, a PDA, which is a mechanism by which the private sector is brought in earlier in the process to help us develop the project. And as a result, they get to have essentially what becomes a sole source agreement for the construction and potentially operations and maintenance of the project. So you forego some competition at the end, but you get much more innovation throughout the project because the private sector is there involved in the environmental process from day one. Really interesting and exciting process that we're just getting going. We're expecting to get an RFQ out early next year. And then our express lanes, we are planning a Tier 1 express lanes network, which includes several of the freeways in Los Angeles area. These express lanes are HOV lanes that are converted to HOT, and then we usually add another one, so we get 2 lanes of HOT. And that is critical for allowing people to bypass congestion if they want to. and encouraging HOV use. The planned delivery we had was based entirely on political needs, so we were giving people their project at the right time in order to satisfy political needs. The unsolicited proposal we got from Goldman Sachs said, don't do that. Instead, you can bond against the future revenue of the entire network and build the whole thing in 10 years. And instead of having a 40-year plan, we now have a 10-year plan based on a proposal from the private sector. This is exactly where our people in the congestion management department said, well, I could have thought of that. Yes, you could have. But we're now delivering it in 10 years, a very ambitious goal, but we believe it can be achieved because we are building the ones that develop the most revenue first, bonding against those, and then we have money for the rest of them. This is something I've heard a few times. We shouldn't give our customers more options. That will confuse them. What other business would say that, right? But I've heard it at Metro. Here are a few things that we are doing to give our customers more options. And these all came from unsolicited proposals from either outside or inside the agency. Mobile tolling, very simple concept. Instead of using a transponder, you use your phone to pay the toll. Should be easy, right? We have pretty good ideas of where people are located. So we're going to be testing virtual gantries and payment by phone on a number of on our existing toll roads, which are the 10 and the I-10 and express lanes, and see if this is a mechanism by which we could improve customer experience and convenience, reduce costs, and reduce evasion. Just running through these quickly because I know I'm short on time. Real-time customer information. People do not have good information about when vehicles are arriving, and that's largely our fault. We got an unsolicited proposal from a company that said that they could improve that. They did by slapping GPSs on our buses and producing a new algorithm for bus prediction that was better than our current algorithm. And as a result, we've now made the decision to equip all of our buses with Wi-Fi within the next 3 years, which will greatly improve arrival prediction, but also to update our algorithm. And both of those things are really critical because, as you know, perceived wait time for transit can also often be 2.5 times what the actual wait time is. So people really care about knowing when their vehicle is going to arrive. Smart bike racks, a great, easy, interesting solution. You walk up to a transit station, you want to lock your bike. Well, it's often difficult to do. We have lockers, but those are cumbersome. This one, you just use your tap card, which is our transit card, and you unlock the bike rack, put your bike in, lock it up again with your tap card, and walk away. Really simple, easy to use, and we're going to be testing that out and see if it helps. This is a waste of time and money. That's what Bob told me. I often am confronted with people who have very strong opinions based on very little data, and I have no choice but to try to deal with that because I'm just a small department in a huge 10,000 person agency. I can't force people to do anything. But what I can do is work through the system. So one example of how we did that, this is an unsolicited proposal we received from within the organization saying on our orange line, which is a bus rapid transit line, we could improve travel times and give smoother ride for customers if the driver simply knew when, how fast they should be driving in order to make all the lights. Because the lights are timed, but they don't know when it's going to be green. They're just kind of speeding up and then slamming on the brakes. Very simple. You put an iPad or other device in the cab of the driver knows exactly what speed to drive. Now you're hitting all the lights. Great idea. Why wasn't it going anywhere when it came from within the organization? Probably because someone said that's a waste of time and money. That's what Bob told me. Or some other reason. But now we're testing it. That's the power of having an innovation office. Drone-based inspection system. You can use drones to inspect your facilities. It's a lot cheaper than walking the 100 miles of rail that we have every day. This is something we're going to be testing and doing in-house based on an unsolicited proposal. This is an example of where I went to one part of the agency and said, we should do this, and they said, go away. And so I went to another part of the agency and said, what do you think? And they said, this is great. And that's the type of thing that happens to me all the time. So this is just to kind of sum up what we've been doing and I'm trying to accomplish at the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. Creating a agency that is open to new ideas, that focuses on trying to solve problems, that isn't thinking about how do I optimize my workflow, but is instead thinking about how do I solve the problems that people are giving us money to solve. That's a critical way of thinking that we've tried to introduce into LA Metro. When we first got there, we would come to people and say, here's this idea, what do you think? And everyone would say, that's a terrible idea. I hate that idea. Here's why it won't work. I'll give you 10 reasons. But now, after 3 years, we've got to the point where we bring people ideas and they are excited by them. And they are now thinking, okay, what would it take to get this idea done? Is it worth it to get this idea done? It's changed the way the organization thinks, and I think it's been a real benefit for in terms of trying to solve the mobility challenges for Los Angeles County. So thanks for having me here, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Great, thank you, Joshua. And make sure you invite Commissioner Dunn when we use our smartphone as transponders, because she's been pitching that for at least a decade. So it's all good. It's all good. So anyway, we're going to move on next to Hari and Signal Labs.
Great. Thank you guys for having me. I don't have slides today. I kind of want to just tell you the story of Signal Labs, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation about it when we get to the questions. Signal started a few years back when a few friends of mine were driving on Big Sur, and they weren't drinking, they weren't texting, they weren't doing anything wrong. It was 3 people in the car, we're all students at Stanford, and they just missed a turn on a dark road, and they ended up going over a cliff, and they all ended up dying on impact. And I'd been working in cars and maps for years and years before school and after, and so this incident really got to me because it seemed like it could be very, very preventable. And there was so much going on in, hey, how do you just take this and make the car smarter, right? We all jumped to how could the car have just stopped and got itself, et cetera. That when I went and actually looked at the area, what occurred to me was something very different. What occurred to me was, why couldn't there have just been a yield sign there? These were all super intelligent people. They were super focused. By no means were they doing anything wrong. They just missed a curve. That's all they did. So I started thinking about that sign with the triangle and a pole, and I started saying, hey, why hasn't anyone just reinvented this, right? It has been around, the first one went in around 1750, and it looks the exact same today, which, you know, for reasons of consistency than it does before. And that just struck me as very, very wrong. So it was obvious to me right away that we can't just go putting signs every block. That's just not going to work. We talked about some of the space constraints. It's not going to happen. So I started thinking about how would we actually make a different kind of traffic signal, a net that could kind of help us and surround us, but obviously work in the world we did. And that solution quickly came to me that needed 3 parts. The first is it had to be smart. You can't just show someone a sign constantly saying cautious. I mean, we've all seen the studies, or maybe you have a car that I particularly have a Volvo. We have a 2-year-old now, so we got the safest car we could think of. And I swear every time we get in that car, it just like freaks out, right? It just starts beeping that things are happening everywhere. So of course, it would be to turn off some of that blind spot. So how do we actually get smart about it, right? And so I went and looked through some of the data, and it turns out, you know, a lot of people who end up speeding through a school zone, they just lose track of time. So, hey, how could we make this a little smarter? How could we make this more dynamic to show you what we need? The second thing that occurred to me, it had to be digital. This happens to me all the time now that I'm aware of it. I'm looking at it. I'm from Chicago, and snow covers the sign. Or I just actually got rerouted today on the way here, and the sign to the highway had fallen over. The one on Peninsula, I missed the curve and had to come back through. And so the question started coming to me, hey, why are we so dependent on these physical signs? What can we do digitally to help people go through? And the third thing, and the honest thing, and it had to be cheaper. We had to find a way that, hey, if this person passed away, I went and looked, and there is still no sign there today. Because it takes time to decide whether we put a sign there. It actually takes effort to go see what we do. And when I started looking at some of the back-end offices, I'll get to this in a second on the process of what we actually do. You know, there's a lot of overhead to discern if a sign has actually fallen over, and there's certainly overhead to determine where we actually put a sign. In fact, there's no real, I would say, math to it right now. There's a lot of art to it, and there's a lot of kind of planning that comes through. So how can we self-automate that? How can we help basically say a sign should be here and be more proactive about it? And so that was the 3 things that we took into Signal Labs, and we made a solution. Now what is the solution? So basically it's an app. That's how it looks today. And the reason I'm smiling about it because I make it look simple, right? You go and press a button, and all of a sudden you're driving around, this thing starts popping up signs. And so right now the majority of people who use it are fleet customers. But as you're driving around, it'll basically tell you, hey, there's some dynamic information. There was an accident there yesterday. Hey, this is a high accident zone. This is an intersection you have to be particularly careful because there's a lot of biker pedestrians. Things that we just cannot tell them through a sign, but things that they should be able to know. My favorite one, the one that I end up stopping on, is 2-way stop signs. It's very hard when you're driving through a new area to decide if it's a 2-way stop sign or not. So we inform people of those items as well. Behind there, there's another layer, which is the basically intelligence layer. What we did is we went to each city that we could, because as you guys know, traffic signs are stored at a local level mostly, and we had to get that data in and start standardizing it. Now, not a lot of cities didn't have that, so what we actually had to do was send people out on the ground. We had task rabbits and those people who went around to each block, and they had to write down what signs actually exist on each block. And we happily gave it back to the city, because I think when we started inventorying it, it was actually a very useful thing. As you can imagine, that scales in so many ways, but we were able to get a lot of metro areas done, especially the Bay Area, as we went from there. And then the layer underneath for that is basically what we call the data layer. And what we're doing is we're constantly trying to find new data sources in order to do it. We work with insurance companies for accident data. We recently got glare data. As you can imagine, as you're driving in particular areas, glare comes through. So when we started correlating that, we saw research that basically made us realize that glare is actually a big issue. So we could give people different kind of signage, and we go from there. And then we started getting density data as well. So if you're driving in a rural area, like we talked about earlier, the signage you need is very different than when you're driving in a city area. Can't be blocked every minute, so we needed to start going through there. And that was the solution that we have today. It's an app that looks very simple. Behind the scenes, it is very, very complex, and it works from there. Now, what does this all mean for you guys, and what does it actually mean? There's a couple things I was hoping to get a chance to talk to you guys today. The first is it is very difficult to get consumers to care about safety. When you put an app in the App Store, and there are millions and millions of apps you're competing with, it is not an app that you can just come in and say, look, I'm stuck here today, I want to go download something. It is something that you actually need to kind of market in a different way. And I'm more and more convinced that the ability to market this will come through people like you. Through people like you who can help educate the world that, hey, there is better systems out there, and help educate your local offices as well as yourselves that maybe there's some other solutions we start looking at. Because I'm happy to walk you through this when we talk, but I can promise you I've been doing this for a long time, and the cost of acquisition like this will not make a sustainable business. This will not be a way that'll happen unless you guys get involved. That's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk about during the Q&A is basically how the data is actually stored today. I think we have a real issue today. I think that the data that we keep on signs, and the signs that we know are actually up and the signs that are actually down, is probably the most efficient bullet that we can do to improve safety. It scared me when I started going to offices and they didn't actually know which signs were up and which were down and where they were. I think that's a very scary proposition that we don't have a current state of our actual signage. The third thing I want to talk about is we've been working with the private companies. As you guys know, a lot of the traffic signals are private company in terms of putting this into traffic signals. So now that we have data on this, why can't we make the traffic signals that we already have a little bit smarter? So they're more dynamic, they're more timely, et cetera. And we're having a lot of luck there. I think we're showing some pretty good results, but I think in order to do that at scale, again, we need to work with you. Now, one thing that's very unique about Signal that I'm very excited I'm here today is Signal has been a passion of love. Basically what it is, all of us have day jobs. We basically pull together more and more people who have had victims that they know been in traffic accidents, and the team is growing in the sense that we all kind of work at nights and weekends in order to get this done. So Signal is very rare in the sense I can be here today and actually not ask for money because it's done through a labor of love. But what we do need is time and attention. So I'm hoping when we get a chance to talk to the Q&A, we'll have a chance to talk about that. Thank you, guys.
Great. That's exciting to think about what's happening or what might be. So, Rob, you want to clean up here and get this panel wrapped up?
Sure, and I'll be quick. I think my presentation is perhaps too long for the amount of time we have, and I know people want to get some questions out there. So first, it's been really interesting. Thank you for having me, first of all. I really appreciate that. Rima can speak to this. We contacted about this event my very first day at Aurora. So I'm fairly new at Aurora, but I signed up pretty quickly when she said, come speak about Aurora. I said, as soon as I learn something about it, I'll come and speak. So hopefully I'm a little bit more educated in the last 3 months. But this conversation has been interesting because some of the underlying assumptions from Ron and Joshua are AV technology will work. So I really appreciate that faith. I think that kind of speaks to some of the interactions between governments and the private sector, is that there is still some faith that this technology can work. I think that's a really true thing that's happening at Aurora. So we do self-driving cars. We're relatively new. We were founded about a year and a half ago. And our mission is to deliver the benefits of self-driving technology safely, quickly, and broadly. And one of the things that I think underlies a lot of this conversation but hasn't been mentioned today is the amount of deaths and carnage on our roads today. We're talking 40,000 deaths each year on American roads, 1.3 million globally. This technology, I think, really has the ability to help reduce the amount of deaths on the road. I think fundamentally it will provide a level of safety. I'm not saying that all deaths will go away. I think some have said that's the goal. I love that goal. I think we will strive for that goal. But if we can begin to reduce the amount of unfortunate deaths and pain caused by today's level of accidents, I think this technology will be well worth it. I also think we've had a bit of a discussion about the access that this technology will bring. One of the studies that Ron put up there was that retirees in a particular study, chauffeur, were using it to get out more. And I think this technology will provide access to folks who had traditionally had difficult times with it. The elderly, individuals with certain impairments, individuals who can't get a driver's license for whatever reason. And I think, talking with some of the elderly groups, AARP and others, social isolation is a big problem. And I think providing affordable, accessible, safe ways for these individuals to get out, become more productive citizens, become more part of the economy, I think these things will all be benefits of AV technology. So, we have a mission. It's something that we're working very hard from. I'll talk about who our founders are, and I think you'll see why I'm so confident that they'll be able to achieve this mission. But the challenge is real. As you'll see from some of these quotes, really what we're trying to do is build the world's most complex computer system to deal with some of the most unique, challenging environments out there that are dynamic, attached into a vehicle and transport our most precious asset, human life, around. So the challenge is real. It's not something that Aurora looks at and says, oh yeah, we just came together last year, 3 guys who never had any experience, and we're going to solve this problem. I think what you'll see from our product is that it has really been a life's work for the individuals who founded this company. And I'll skip to that real quickly, because this is really, I think, speaks to the unparalleled excellence that Aurora is bringing to this problem. Our founders, Chris Urmson, Drew Bagnell, Sterling Anderson, they have a combined 40 years experience working with self-driving vehicles, with AI, machine learning, automotive innovation. These folks in particular are some of the kind of founding fathers of modern day self-driving technology. They've been involved in every self-driving technology effort since the mid-90s, going back to the grand DARPA challenges, the Grand Urban Challenges, DARPA. You'll see Chris in particular. He basically developed and led the Google self-driving car project, which is now Waymo. Drew has been a leader in perception and machine learning for over 20 years. And Sterling is actually one of the few individuals in the space that's actually delivered a product to market, which is always interesting to find, right? He helped develop the Tesla Model X as well as the autopilot function. So real quick, we are founded in late 2016. We're 150 people and growing. We have 2 headquarters, Pittsburgh and Palo Alto. We divide our teams evenly between those 2 headquarters. We're testing in 10 cities and towns, mostly in the peninsula and in and around Pittsburgh. Some of the folks that we've hired are kind of the premier folks. They have experience, whether it's with SpaceX and rockets, with other technology companies, the military, going back to some of the big mining and construction folks that have dealt with some of these challenges around how to develop vehicles that can navigate the complex world without a driver. So a little pat on the back. I think this slide is indicative of the experience that we're bringing, the understanding of the challenges, and our ability to kind of put things out there safely and quickly. Compared to some of the bigger names and more common names that you'll hear, we've done very well for ourselves in the first year. We've been out in the public roads. We've tested on an annualized basis. We would have had more testing miles in California than all but 2 companies in the last year. And that's without incident. And I'll skip over a lot of this. I think this stuff is really interesting. Hopefully you'll get a chance to look at it. It's some of the kind of technical issues about where you place sensors, kind of the sensors that we have, how we do our mapping. It's really interesting, the mapping process. I could spend hours talking about maps. It's fun, and it's really fascinating how what we're doing is a little bit different. We're not using, just real quickly, we're not using off-the-shelf maps. We're building our own high-definition maps. We're doing it in a way that's a little bit different than folks. We're doing what we call locally sharded maps. So instead of trying to get a whole city and buying a map from, say, a provider that's out there that say, oh, here's the map that we have of X city. We go out there, we test in local segments. We run a vehicle out there with all the sensors going, we collect all the data. We do all the labeling of the signage. We do all this in advance, so when it's loaded onto the vehicle has a really great sense of where it is, what's around it, kind of whether it's the signs, the traffic signals, where crosswalks are, where intersections are, everything to localize the vehicle and have it understand its surroundings. And this really helps, particularly when you get to tunnels or places where you lose GPS signal. Urban areas, urban canyons as they call them, and rural areas. So if the mapping that we do will provide the vehicle a sense of always where it is, regardless if there's a GPS signal that's available or not. Obviously, we're taking in information in real time as well as you're going there and comparing it to the two so that it's a dynamic event and you can respond. But it's not always necessary to have the GPS on it every minute. So this is the magic here. This is the central nervous system. This is where everything comes together. I could talk more about that, but the founders may not have me back if I did. No, seriously, I can talk a little bit more about this, but mindful of time, I'll kind of.
What's the size of that?
What's that?
What's its physical size?
The physical size right now, so we're not. It's large. It's about the size. It's smaller than my suitcase, but it's still fairly big. I think what we want to do is get the technology right and then figure out how to shrink it. So right now it sits in the trunk of a vehicle, as most folks who are doing this do. It can run off of the power of the vehicle, and we're using, right now, one of our biggest partners is Volkswagen, and we're using e-Golfs. And so it runs through the power unit on board with the vehicle. Simulation is something that we take very seriously. It's one of the places we're investing a lot of money, a lot of time, finding a lot of experts. I think what I'll say real quickly here is you'll see from, if you read the slide, this is used to test interactions. I mean, this is where we take a vehicle, instead of just running it on a simulator for miles and miles, what we do is we take it in 1 mile and we force it to do hundreds of lane merges or hundreds of situations where a vehicle might be cutting in. How does the vehicle respond? How should it respond? How would an expert driver respond? And so you simulate these events over and over again, and you'll see some of the things that we simulate: cut-ins, hard braking vehicles, contested lane changes, pedestrians that are jaywalking, cyclists in the lane, contested movements at intersections. These are all things that we're testing for in simulation, and it's also part of what we do on our closed course testing as well. We run about 58,000 of these interactions each day. Every time we come back from a test run, we plug the information through the simulator, and then from that last test run, we can simulate what might have happened in certain situations given how that environment was from the log we just had. So it's really useful. I think one of the things to know is that, the space of potential experiences on the road, as we all know, are limitless, right? And so you cannot test in the real world for every incident that you'll see out there. Because strange things happen, right? Tarps fly off. There's the classic example of the woman chasing a duck on a bicycle, right? And so you're not going to experience that in a natural setting all the time. So simulation really helps us understand kind of some of those really unique situations that might arise on the road and how the vehicle would have reacted and then how it should react. I'll speak real quickly here because I want to leave some time for questions. We're using a two-tiered safety approach. One is while we're in our development mode, we have a vehicle operator in the vehicle at all times. We also have a co-pilot in the vehicle at all times. as we move to a production system, we'll start to think about removing those safety assurances. But right now, we have a vehicle operator there because we think it's the first and foremost safety fallback for a vehicle that is a test vehicle. You'll see here the safety concepts are different in both, right? When you have a vehicle operator in there, the safety concept that is the orienting feature is that operator must always be able to regain control of the vehicle. How do you ensure their attentiveness? How do you ensure that they know when they should regain control of the vehicle? All that. When you move to removing that operator, the safety concept is different. You don't want passengers interfering with the operation of the vehicle. You don't want them to have anything to do with the operation of the vehicle. So the safety concepts are different in those two, and they should be approached differently. And then you'll see here I've listed, and you all can read. I don't need to go through this, but here are some of the developmental safety approaches that we use in testing. So manual control is always assured. Self-driving system can always be overridden by one of the actuators, whether it's braking, steering, torque control. We have an emergency stop button that automatically disconnects the vehicle should that be necessary. Our vehicle operators go through a 12-week intense training program, including defensive driving courses and a series of other physical and learned tests. We have co-pilots who are there that not only focus upon the behavior of the vehicle, alerting the vehicle operator certain behaviors, but also there to ensure that the vehicle operator maintains attentiveness, and also is there to ensure that all types of behaviors, potential faults are logged and annotated so that we know. Within the vehicle itself, visual audio alerts, and then we obviously have operational design constraints that we tell the vehicle operator, once you hit one of these constraints, you have to take manual control of the vehicle. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for allowing me to give a little presentation. I know it kind of went quickly, but I'm trying to allow for some time. Hopefully I've done that.
Wow, fantastic. So times are changing, and I would say fasten your seatbelt because I think that the speed of change is going to be phenomenal. And I think part of the challenge is, at least for myself, my PhD in robotics came from Legoland and helping my granddaughters build robots. So it is amazing to me. So with that, I'll defer to my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Dunn, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, every one of you. I just love this stuff, and I really appreciate your time today. So a couple of you mentioned that you thought that it would be nice to have government and a commission take a top-down approach in this. I have zero confidence that any government agency, except maybe for Joshua, is nimble or responsive to new technology. And so I would be careful about that. For example, in the market safety on apps, which I love this idea. I mean, again, I said this yesterday, talk to the auto club. I mean, they're an insurance company first, and everybody thinks of them as the guys to fix your tires. This is exactly what they're looking for. So I would look to the private sector to do this. The other thing that's fascinating to me, and I'd love your comments on this, is the current trends and the future, current operations and future, the trends in the market is customer experience, right? And that's so many of you talked about that today. Retail, housing, public services, utilities. No one wants to wait 4 hours for the cable company to get there to fix your cable box anymore. We have what's called mass customization going on every single day of the week, right? So when you look at that customer experience, doing that, and that's why, Joshua, you speak to my heart, and also Ron, trying to get government to do a top-down approach. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because my theory is we should start, if we're going to get people out of the single-family car and stop driving solo, we need to do a grassroots movement up so that it's hip and cool to be in transit. There's a UCLA study that says we take one trip every 2 weeks on transit, one trip. and we can reduce VMT by something like half or something in the LA area. There's some phenomenal numbers. So if we think about VMT as a grassroots movement, that you get your high school kids involved, your chambers of commerce, your city leaders, and we teach everybody just one trip a week. You got to take something besides your car, and if you can't get to work, taking transit, figure something else. I don't care if you go to dinner at night, doing something. But the TNC response is about customer experience. And so I end with this, and then I'd love you to comment. My son lives up here, he's in the tech industry, and he said to me on Monday, he said, "Mom, my dream job is to be CEO of BART because it's so crappy. I want to change the customer experience of BART." And here's a millennial, right, who won't let his wife ride BART because of exactly what you're trying to do is fix that customer experience to make mass customization. So thoughts on any of that stuff? Sorry, I rambled on, but kind of interesting comments.
First of all, the energy of your comment is awesome.
Oh,
so
I love
thank
you
you
guys.
For,
I'm so
thank you
into
for
what
the
you're
positive
doing.
energy there. The way I look at the world is very similar to you. There are two problems you need to solve. There is one problem of activation, of getting people to understand this technology exists and use it. And there's another problem of experience.
Yes.
And if you don't have the experience part right, there is no point in putting people into the product because they're just going to churn anyway.
Right.
So how we operate against that is we measure two things pretty much every moment. One of the things is if you start the product, if you click on the app, do you actually continue to use the app for the rest of your trip? That means we've done our job of creating an incredible experience, and basically that ratio is correct. And we take the points where someone is dropping off, we understand what those drop-offs are, and we continue to iterate the product. So that's how we look at the experience. The trouble, just to be very open and honest, and the trouble we were having is on the activation piece.
Yeah.
Because there's 2 points of activation. One, you may be taking a new trip, and there's times you might come in as, you're a fleet driver, you're getting, hit up with issues with accidents, and you'll turn it on. But as you get used to that trip, you'll start to get more and more comfortable, despite the fact that dangers actually change. And I think the reason I was asking for you guys to at least consider helping on this or think through it is we have trained the world that we have a very safe system there. That when you drive, we will tell you where there's risk, we will tell you where there's stop signs, we will tell you where there's accidents. And now we are trying to retrain the world that says, hey, there is new technology that can keep you even safer. And that retraining has been very hard. And so the more we can try to figure out ways to do it, I think the more safer our streets will be. So great point. So we actually work with a lot of fleets and on auto clubs as well. I think the consumer side is actually where the activation growth has been slower. It's a great point.
Just recommend you consider submitting an unsolicited proposal to LA Metro. But just to kind of get at the crux of your problem, I think what you're commenting on, and I think the CEO of BART example is a great one of this, is that the customer experience on transit, in Los Angeles at least, is very, very poor. And we have to admit that, right? The first step is admitting you have a problem. And I think that the reason it's poor is partly because of the things we often think about of transit, like, it's not clean enough, it feels uncomfortable, it feels unsafe. But it's largely because it is incredibly uncompetitive in terms of travel time for the vast majority of trips. That's what we found in our customer survey. I mean, not that we needed a survey to know that, but we found in our customer survey is people find that transit's too slow, it takes forever. So that's why I think that although I love the idea of a grassroots campaign, the incentives are so misaligned that a grassroots campaign can't. I mean, I walk out of my house in Los Angeles, in a very urbanized part of Los Angeles, and it is hostile for me to walk. It's hostile for me to bike. The transit is not arriving for another 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm a transit nut. I love, and I still take the subway to work because I'm crazy. But very few people are going to make that choice when you have a situation with the incentives that we have. So that's why. It's not that I think it has to be top down. I agree with you that that's why we have the unsolicited proposal policy, is to get ideas from others. But if you're allocating street space the way that we are, which is highly inefficient and saying first come, first serve, and buses sit in the same traffic as everyone else, and there's no priority for people in transit, and there's no way to price the streets, the only government can play that role of fixing that street space misallocation. Government has to do that because the private sector can't change that.
Without a grassroots buy-in to the concept of one trip a week, my theory, you start having government reallocate street space, you'll have your elected officials recalled tomorrow. So I think it has to be top and bottom, and look at this as a full-on campaign.
Yeah, I'll add to the grassroots concept. It is a cultural issue in many respects. In some of our work, we've actually consulted with behavioral economists to try and understand how can we change behavior, because a lot of what we do on the fixed infrastructure side, the supply signals we send by adding lanes and making it easy to drive a personal vehicle is connected to that cultural preference. I call it the any model. Basically, in America, we want to drive any size vehicle to any destination without any passengers and without any tolls or parking costs. That's our ideal. And we've designed the system around that. And the question is behaviorally, well, how do you do things like get people to share more of their rides? How do you get them to use the transit system? And it is a competitive environment. And that's, I think, the biggest thing we're recognizing is that what's happening in the private sector, whether it was 10 years ago when we were started seeing our cars become much more comfortable places to spend time. We had our cup holders, and we got bigger cup holders, and then we got great audio systems, and now we have audiobooks and podcasts to entertain us. So it's very comfortable to sit in a car for a long period of time. That's the private market response. In the meantime, the public sector response is continue to deliver transit systems, for example, as Joshua just described, that are not terribly convenient and not terribly comfortable. Yeah, and so there is this dichotomy of how we make the government decision that we're going to make. I think one of the things you could think about is at least what are the decisions that we're currently making right now, and are they really aligned with the outcomes that we're desiring? Most states and the federal government are being very accommodative towards autonomous vehicles, the piloting, the testing, preparing for them. We don't see as much work saying they have to be delivered as electric vehicles. They have to be delivered in a fleet that guarantees that we're going to have a higher degree of sharing than we do today. We don't see those policies or regulations. We do hear calls for pricing, and I think that's come up a few times. But I think we have to be very careful here, because right now, if you think about pricing, we use that term, congestion pricing, it's a tax. Pricing doesn't necessarily create a travel market. Uber and Lyft have created a travel market where supply and demand are balanced based on the prices that they charge us. Demand pricing, surge pricing. So to the extent that we want government to recognize that their role in this is balance the public good with the private sector desire to generate revenues and profits, it's almost like there's a teeter-totter, and government at some point at least has to step on the other end. How hard you step and how you step, those are the big policy questions.
Commissioner Burke?
I have questions, but I'll ask fast as I can. Mine are very simple questions. We talked a lot about looking at Uber and Lyft in terms of their impact on transit. Uber and Lyft are now filing proposals for scooters. They have filed requests, and they're competing with Bird. Where does that fit in? Who's riding these scooters beside kids going to high school? We have a whole series of issues. Now, I don't know whether in Washington you've got a lot of them, but I want to tell you in Los Angeles, they are overtaking the sidewalks. You have accidents, you have multiple users on the scooter, and you probably think, well, that's not very serious. But if Uber and Lyft, who are innovators, are filing competition with Bird, I think that I'm really interested. What is their impact on transit? Have there been any numbers?
It's so new that there's very little data, but my understanding is what has been gathered so far indicates that mostly they're substituting for walking. So
Okay.
People are using them instead of walking. You can think about whether that's a positive or a negative. It depends on your perspective, I suppose.
Well, at some point, I have to believe it's going to have some impact on transit.
Yeah,
On probably not rail, but bus.
Yeah, one of the things to think about with any of these new disruptive modes is there is a kind of a combination of speed is one of the important factors. And when we first started seeing bike share systems come into play, a lot of people thought they were going to complement the transit system, but in some cases, the speed of those bikes in downtown environments was fast enough that they competed with some of the transit trips. And think about an electric scooter. They're capping the speeds at 15 miles an hour. In downtown LA, the average speeds are probably closer to 5 or 6 miles an hour if you're in a car. It's less than that if you're in a bus. So an electric scooter is one of the fastest modes available in downtown, whether you're going a half mile, 1 mile, or 3 miles. So these new disruptive modes, if they're powered by electric motors, whether it's an e-bike or an e-scooter, really have the opportunity to compete with all the modes in these very congested downtowns. Now, they also happen to be one of the more efficient space uses that you could have in terms of a mode. And so this is, I think, a critical question for cities is, here you have a very low emission vehicle that takes up very little space but has a relatively high operating speed. Is that superior to what you're currently accommodating, which are very large vehicles with a single occupant? Those are some of those policy trade-offs.
Right, and if I could just really add on that, I think it's really interesting that it is Uber and Lyft who are in there, right? So I think we've talked a lot about, and for full disclosure, I used to work for Lyft for the last 3 years before I came over to Aurora. And I'm not here to make a big defense, but what I was going to say is we talked a lot about congestion and vehicle miles traveled. And a lot of those trips happen to be short trips in and around the cities, right? So Uber and Lyft, I think, are trying to recognize, well, if we are in part of the issue of congestion here, and there are models on pricing to influence shared rides and other things like that, if we can own or be a part of the alternative to that, which is scooters, getting people out of the cars to take those trips, maybe causing less cars to be on the road, less need for the Uber and Lyfts to be circling around, I think it makes a lot of sense. It not only helps them address a problem that a lot of regulators believe they're causing, but it also gives them an opportunity to scale out a different business model. And they already have the consumers built in, right? So that's their advantage, is that they already have millions of consumers who have signed up. And so they can open up the app and have an approach what a lot of folks here always talk about, which is that multimodal option, where you open it, you can take an Uber or Lyft, you can take a scooter, you can take a bike. I think the idea perhaps ultimately is to get to, can you integrate that with mass transit as well? So all those options are out there.
Okay, I'm going to go to Commissioner Kehoe, and then I see Gardino in the queue line. Anybody else? Okay. Other commissions, don't be shy here, obviously. We want to hear from everybody.
Thank you, Fran. Great discussions. All of the presentations were wonderful. I agree. One thing that jumped out at me, I think, from the first two, Ron and especially, okay, so the vehicle miles traveled in the real world are almost the exact opposite of our policy goals as far as vehicle miles traveled goes. So that was clear. And our transit and rail ridership is down, and we are making huge investments in transit and rail, especially rail. It's so expensive. In your opinion, are those investments wise? Are we going to get a return on them? Are they sustainable, or are we seeing a trend for transit and rail, except in maybe special corridors, kind of going down? The Uber and Lyft are so convenient. And one more thing is, I see the really young kids can get into Uber and Lyft. I don't know if they're using their parents' credit cards or what, but they look like high school kids. And I mean, it's so much more appealing than waiting at the bus stop. So tell me what's going to happen there.
Yeah, so you're hitting at the heart of the most challenging question is we have to make investments in the transportation network, and they tend to be these long-term investments, right? We expect them to not only last decades, but to operate well during those decades. I think one of the things that we're learning as we've gone through the modeling and testing is what we need public agencies to think about more often is doing a risk assessment. If you're going to be making investments, and even the current investments you've made in the past, you really want to take an assessment of how these disruptive changes could affect you. What we're learning on the transit side is the places that are most at risk of disruption are rural and suburban transit systems. Basically, they're expensive to deliver the transit, and there are much more cost-effective models either using TNCs or some form of demand-responsive microtransit even. So they're going to be most at risk. But our modeling is also showing that even the large systems potentially are at risk, and the current data is showing that they're at risk. And so when you think about, well, what can make these systems much more effective, what we're learning from the Seattle, I think, example is that, yeah, to the extent that you make them really competitive, they're convenient, they're clean, there's a high quality of service, those are all factors customers care about. And so to the extent that you can evolve the current transit systems, especially the rail systems to that level, we would expect they'd continue to be used. But if we continue to see safety issues, maintenance issues, outage issues, lots of police actions on the BART system, if you're here from California and use BART at all, I've had a number of trips disrupted because of that, and I end up having to use the TNCs as my plan B. So to the extent that we need to evolve the systems, given the increased level of competition that's coming, I think we do need to look at it through that risk assessment lens.
If I could ask.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I just respond quickly? I just want to make the point that I don't think our goal is to reduce VMT. I think our goal is to improve mobility. And VMT, and similarly, I don't think our goal is to increase transit ridership. I think that's the wrong goal for LA Metro. Maybe not every transit agency, for LA Metro. Our goal is to improve mobility for people and goods in LA. And and when you take it through that lens, there is no question that we need to make the transit investments that we're planning on making, because those transit investments essentially are securing right-of-way for large vehicles to go freely without hitting traffic. That's what those investments are. It's either underground, or it's at street, or it's elevated, or it's busway, whatever it is. It's right-of-way for large vehicles, and that has to happen because we're not building any more freeways of any substantial capacity in Los Angeles County. And even if we price the system perfectly accurately, you still have increasing demand for mobility, and people need alternatives. And finally, because we don't have an equitable system, we have a tremendous inequity between the haves and have-nots when it comes to owning a car or not owning a car, and so that gap has to be closed by providing better transit alternatives. So I think no matter what happens to autonomous vehicles, and I'm much more skeptical than my fellow panelists about the timeline for autonomous vehicles, no matter what happens with those, you're still going to need large vehicles carrying people through highly urbanized areas at higher rates of speed.
And may I do one more, if that's all
sure.
right?
Yeah.
So, thank you for your thoughts. It's very good. In both Ron and Joshua's presentations earlier, and really in all of them, what you just said about the haves and the have-nots, the ones that have access, the ones that don't, the ones who have a smartphone, and the ones that don't, we haven't addressed economic justice issues, but they're right there. And transit and getting around a city and getting to employment and healthcare and schools is, one of the essential ways of changing your life from having less money to having maybe a little bit more. Joshua, how's Los Angeles dealing specifically with economic justice issues and access in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think that's at the core of what we're trying to do. If you look at our strategic plan, there is a case to be made. There's a goal in the strategic plan that says target the investments in transportation to where they're needed the most, which is not where they would necessarily be targeted based purely on political need, right? And
Right.
thinking about who needs these investments and who doesn't. Also, LA Metro recently adopted an equity platform, which I encourage you to look at. From our planning departments, defining what equity is, which was a grassroots effort to define what is equity and how we're going to try to meet it in everything we do. So it's a critical component of what we do. But I think the most important way that we can improve equity in transportation in Los Angeles is to create a public transit system that works for the people who need it. And right now, as you just said, people's ability to make more money or to have access to things that many of us take for granted is severely limited by the scope and the speed of our public transit system because it's wholly inadequate. So when we make those investments in transit, we close that equity gap. We make it so that more people have access to more things and create a more just, fair and equitable society.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gardino? Oh, are you?
He was gonna-
One quick comment. On the equity line, I'm glad you raised it because some of the things we're finding is that the equity gap differs by land use context. So yes, in the city of LA or city of San Francisco, you're going to see one potential gap. As you get to the suburbs, though, the gap definitely changes. In rural areas, it can get actually quite a bit larger. And one of the things we're finding when you think about people that are transit dependent, that don't own a vehicle today or can't afford to use Uber or Lyft, that when you look to the transit system, how it's currently operated in those suburban contexts and the rural context, and this is outside the cities, that's one of the areas where you can make a lot of improvement, because that type of service is very expensive to provide
Right.
through a traditional transit means, because you're paying drivers for an 8-hour shift and you're providing service that's very low productivity. Uber and Lyft have the advantage that you only pay for the trip when you make it. But even the users of the system are disadvantaged because they have long wait times for a 1-hour headway on a lot of suburban and rural transit. If they could call up Uber or Lyft, they'd have the 5-minute or 10-minute wait time, and then their experience in vehicle would be the same as being in a passenger car, much faster than having to stop at every transit station. So when you look at the state of California or Washington or Oregon, they're so big, they're so diverse, that there's not this one-size-fits-all on any of these issues. And when you start to look through the equity lens, you can start to come up with different solutions in one land use context that may not be appropriate in the more urbanized area, as Josh has pointed out, where you do need that high-capacity transit. So I think we do need to start looking through the equity lens, but do it on a geographic context or a place-type context to understand those nuances.
Thank you. Thanks, Fran.
Commissioner Gardino?
Yes, an unscientific observation and then a question. The unscientific observation about the age or demographics of scooter users. As admittedly, as clumsy as I have been at every age of my life, but especially at this point in my life, I would never get on a scooter. But I was just trying to observe it over the weekend in downtown San Jose, which is the 10th largest city in America. I expected just to see young people. It was all the way across the spectrum. I had 911 patched into my phone as I saw people of my generation and older on these things over the weekend, but I know that's a completely unscientific sample, but it was not what I expected. Would love any feedback on if there's any demographic information currently available on that. In terms of the incredibly compelling slides about the rise of TNCs and the fall of transit and the correlation between the two, to the extent there's correlation. The gentleman from Aurora who used to work for Lyft, I believe you mentioned, data from at least a couple of years ago here in the Bay Area, if my memory is correct, Lyft trips, about 20% were to Caltrain and BART stations and other fixed rail transit stations where there was a symbiotic relationship of connecting passengers going to and from those stations. Is that accurate information?
Yes. Prior to my leaving just a couple months ago, I think that was up to 33% of all trips in the Bay Area began or end around a Caltrain or a BART station. As well as, speaking of shared rides, almost 50% of our rides are shared rides here in the San Francisco area. So, I mean, I think there are, there's data out there that suggests that there are possibilities for overlap and for working together to increase transit ridership. And I think it's really interesting that Josh was saying that transit ridership numbers are not the absolute way to measure success in this area. I think that's right. I think mobility and being able to move freely, to have access, to speak to the equity question of who's being served, right? Where is it being served? Where are there transportation deserts, and how can technology help to solve that? I think autonomous vehicles will come into play on that because the cost comes down. If you combine them with an on-demand service, whether it's something from MicroTransit in concert with a municipality or something that is done on our own, I think you can have a real benefit to reaching people who have not yet been served well by current transit patterns.
And if anyone else would like to comment, by the way, I think Lucy has to do this too. I always have to say this disclosure. Uber and Lyft are member companies of my day job. So I feel better now that I have disclosed that.
One thing I'll note on the scooters and the demographics, no scientific evidence, but I will often ask riders, why they chose scooter over an e-bike whenever I'm traveling. And one of the things I've heard, and this is from younger and older, scooters are easier to ride than bikes. People are
Yeah.
nervous to get on a bike. Scooters are, to them, easier, simpler. I'll attest to that. I'm a big bicyclist, but I do thoroughly enjoy the scooters. So I do think
You can ride them in a dress or a skirt.
or a skirt. Yeah, that's another comment. Yeah, so I do think scooters solve a bunch of potential problems, whether it's what you're wearing or the speed you need to get to someplace. So yeah, that's it's a good observation.
And I'd say don't discount the sweat factor either.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons I never take a
Yeah.
bike, is I don't want to show up somewhere sweating in a suit. So I hop on a scooter, and whether I'm in DC or here, and I get somewhere, and hopefully I look as good as I do now.
I want to guarantee you, if I rode a scooter in a skirt, I'd be sweating.
I just want to make a quick comment about the TNC thing, because I absolutely, yes, mobility is the goal, but it has to be a level playing field. I mean, you've got, this crisis in New York where taxi drivers are killing themselves. There's a reason for that. It's because we've allowed this playing field to become unfair. And yes, all mobility solutions are welcome, but they have to be equitable. We have to serve everybody, and we have to find a way to make sure that competition is fair. Because otherwise, what you do wind up with are the distortions in the market that we're seeing right now, which is overconsumption of TNCs, overconsumption of road space, leading to a lot of negative externalities, such as greater traffic congestion and greater environmental pollution. So government has to play a role in solving those challenges.
And that unfairness goes both ways, though, because if you look at TNCs and how
Yeah.
taxi companies try to block them from every airport, or work for rules that, hey, you're 10 minutes away in a queuing area when we can pull right up to where people are coming off the planes, there's an imbalance on both sides of that equation.
Okay, this is absolutely fantastic. We could be here all day, I think, but Commissioner Van Kynenberg?
So, Ron, this is the second time you presented to the commission, and I would like to see, for the California staff, Susan, it may be time that, he offers some policy responses in the back of his presentation, and, I think one of the most striking things is, back in October, this commission approved the state rail plan. And one of the last sections of that plan was risks. And it listed a lot of risks to the state rail plan of rising sea levels, things like that. It did not talk about disruptive technology. And, I brought it up at time, but kind of so to speak, the train was leaving the station and that report was done. But, we need to have, staff needs to come back to us at some point with a real policy. Which of these policies are we going to take into account in our work that we do? This issue of whether it's realistic, there's a lot of discussion about VMT and about where it's going and what effects it's going to have. We need to have a comprehensive, take the data, take the policy response. What's realistic? Especially for our next meeting in November, I'd like to have some thought process on that. And then finally, I think the rural counties and rural municipal planning areas are really struggling with what you're talking about, which is we're running long bus routes between rural areas. I mean, I am from a part of the state where you could have a bus that has to go 20 miles to get to the hub before then can take another bus, and you might have to wait an hour. So to get to a job or a hospital or some service, it's a 2 hour there, 2 hour back for somebody. When if they had if they had a direct link. So what are the policy issues as we distribute money? Are we going to be flexible about distributing money in the future? Are we going to be flexible so those are some, I'd like to start seeing some policy discussion. And finally, Joshua, by the way, improving mobility, Joshua, I really appreciate that. what's interesting is, what does that really mean long-term? Because it may mean that some of our sacred cows get sacrificed along the way. And then finally, Joshua, I'd just be curious, what do you realistically see as the timeline where you're launching your product into the marketplace? Because I'm getting mixed signals, and I think this has been brought up. And we were at the proving grounds at Concord yesterday. Toyota, both their CEO and the people they had there, they're pretty cautious. Your team, I'm familiar with Carnegie Mellon back because in the farm equipment, some of your people were in the forefront of the self-driving farm equipment that John Deere bought and buried. I'd be curious what you guys see as a realistic timeline, just in 30 seconds or less, because I'm gone over my time.
Sure. For timeline, our timeline is to have something in production with our partners for deployment in 2021.
Okay.
That's our ultimate timeline. So we work with Volkswagen, Hyundai, and a few other manufacturers. So they're the ones that will be putting the product out into market. We're kind of building the technology for them. And so the timeline we're working on with them is 2021 for something for consumers.
Okay.
Paul, one of the things you mentioned that I think is really important to think about, and this gets to the sacred cows or the legacy projects, which is another label for them. A lot of the problems we define in California revolve around congestion. And the way we define congestion is the cars are moving too slow and they need to go faster. One of the problems with that, it's better to describe that as a symptom. It's a symptom of the fact that we drive these really large cars with very low occupancy levels. You can actually measure it as seat utilization. That's one of my favorite metrics. And we've measured that on California freeways. Hard to find a California freeway where you will see higher than 35% seat utilization in the peak hours. That means all those seats are empty. If you were to look at parallel transit facilities like BART or Caltrain, you will see standing room only. It's over 100% seat utilization during that same time period. And so because we haven't looked at the transportation network equitably across a metric like seat utilization, we really misdiagnosed the problem. We think we need to widen freeways that are really, as public infrastructure, performing really inefficiently. And so question number one should be, can you improve the seat utilization of the freeway before you expand it? That's not a question we typically ask. We typically are adding facilities. Now, we oftentimes will add managed lanes today, but we're still adding, and we're not really improving the efficiency of the existing network before we make that large fixed investment. And that's what we're starting to see in some of the other states, is they're looking much more closely. We did a project in Utah where that was one of our metrics, seat utilization. Before they were going to widen I-15, they wanted to see what could we do to make sure we're operating as effectively and as efficiently as possible.
Well, we need to go from having this discussion to a point where it comes to a policy paper to where it comes before the commission and is vetted in workshops. So what I'd like you to do is start working with staff and all of you, and I'm putting you on the spot. Maybe you don't want to work with our staff, but they're nice people, I swear. She looks mean, but she's very nice. But I really want to get us to where we're putting some policy into place.
Just want to make the comment that it's kind of my job to kill the sacred cows, so that's why I was hired. So happy to do it.
And commissioners, I would just like to just thank this great panel and assure you that Ron Milam is someone who I do call from time to time, and I've greatly appreciated his always taking my call, and he has always done that. So as staff, we will continue working with the experts in the industry, and you have a role in advising the legislature in California. And so we will put together some good policy recommendations for your consideration. Also want to just remind you, we do not have a November meeting, but we will be. December would work. So, but if we can get something done before that time, that'll be our goal.
Okay, we need to hear from Kings County over here. So being very polite and patient. So Shiv, you're up.
We're running behind. It's fine. It's fine.
Mine is more of a comment than a question. And I love the word extraordinary innovation. I think by putting the word extraordinary, you raise the level of innovation. I love that part. The second part, you went out in 2016 for the unsolicited proposals. And I do not know whether those 3 projects that you selected, mega project, whether they are based on new technology or based on existing technology, new applications. There's a difference between the two. And the fact is that you moving forward by accepting proposals, that gives the indication to the private sector that this is the office that we want to deal with, where when we submit something, doesn't just get shoved in and nobody looks at it. But it also at the same time, why only in 2016? You should do it more. Come up, because every other year you come with a proposal, there are new players. And when they look at it, that you're selecting proposals, again, my question is based on new technology or based on existing technology, new applications, or a mixture of it. You need to send signals to the private sector that I'm open to both the ideas, because new technologies are high risk, high reward, whereas existing technology, new applications may be somewhat less. But I think that's the message that you need to give to the private sector for them to come on and probably announce it, that you might do that every biennium year to come up with some new unsolicited proposal so that you can get some ideas on that.
Yeah, well, just to clarify, the policy was launched in 2016. It continues indefinitely. So it's not like we just accepted it in 2016. We continue to get unsolicited proposals all the time. And we're constantly on the lookout and constantly talking to people, like gentleman to my right, about potentially submitting new ideas. So, and it's not just about technology. I want to emphasize that. I know that people often think about innovation and technology as being the same, but a lot of the mega projects, for example, the value is not in the technology that's being offered. The value is in the project delivery mechanism that's being offered. Typically, when we deliver projects in the public sector, we deliver them with a design bid build or maybe design build procurement model. And when you do that, you don't take into account life cycle costs. You don't have the same people designing and building the system who are then going to operate and maintain the system, right? And the downside of that is that we often will design a system that can't be operated efficiently as effectively as otherwise we could, and it won't be oriented as much toward the customer as if we are the same people designing and building it as operating and maintaining it. That's the theory of this project delivery mechanism. Also, going in with that theory is when the private sector has skin in the game, then there's money involved. When they don't get paid unless they meet certain performance outcomes, you get better projects. So innovation, and especially on mega projects, but generally, is not just about technology. It's about doing things that we haven't done before. And the reason that we hadn't done them before is that, in part, because we hadn't had an Office of Extraordinary Innovation created to say, we're going to do things we haven't done before. And that was created by our CEO, Phil Washington, in 2015, and he launched this unsolicited proposal. And he came up with the word extraordinary, by the way, so he deserves full credit for that. I was very skeptical about it. But this guy is a former military man and said, look, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And this is not, and it put tremendous pressure on us and on the agency to meet that expectation. I think that's been highly beneficial.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up, but I just have absolutely loved this discussion. I would like for us to create an environment where our panelists could have a good debate amongst themselves as well, because I think what we've done is we've been kind of a little bit siloed, and I'd love to hear them kind of talk about each other and how we all move forward. And I just think, it was mentioned customer service, hospitality. We're all here to serve, and I think we can't lose sight of that, and that's what really matters. And I think Joshua talking about mobility, it's mobility, I'll call it with a smile, where people want to be there and feel good about what their options are and how they are. So join me in thanking this panel. Washington, let's do it again. We may not want to wait 2 years. I can't imagine what changes we'll have. So you guys are up in the queue next, but I think we could continue this. So with that, we're going to do a quick change out, and nobody on this panel mentioned the next topic, but I would have loved to put one of our next speakers, Chris Shimoda, at your table and had the same level of discussions around what we can do in the freight sector. So it'd be great. So thank you all very much. So we'll take a quick 5-minute break.